Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Best Day Ever Media. As always, I'm your host, Matt McKeever, joined by my co-host, Adam Martin. Hey, Adam, how are you doing?
Good morning, everybody. Doing excellent. Having an excellent rainy morning here, but still loving it. Excited for the news today.
Nice. I'm excited to jump into it too. And reminder, we're always live here at noon Eastern Standard Time. And I was about to say that we're not live on Rumble, but it looks like Rumble was just doing some weird shit, and we are finally live on Rumble. I can't help but notice I'm going to comment on it. Yesterday, we got a lot of views on Rumble. Now, I've heard rumors that Rumble is like botting their views and stuff. So if you guys are watching this on Rumble, just like leave us a comment, right? Or leave a live comment because I'm just fascinated to know like did really 83 honest people watch us yesterday? Or was it like me plus 82 bots? So let me know by commenting. That's the best way for me to know whether this is real or not. But, anyways, let's jump into a quick little summary of the stories we're going to cover today. There's a lot to get into. So first things first, we're going to be talking about the Bank of Canada. Today they met at 10:30. They did do a rate hike, so we'll jump into that. We've obviously got a recap on the Emergencies Act as well. We're also going to be talking about Doug Ford and how he seems to be dodging the bullet in regards to actually coming forward and talking about the Emergencies Act during the inquiry. We're going to be talking about Adidas cutting ties with Ye. Also, we're going to be talking about the JCCF here in Canada and their frustrations with the judge that decided mootness in regards to vaccine mandates and the entire court case that was going to play out over that. And then finally, we're also going to talk about Judge ending New York's vaccine mandates for city workers. And that's just our news updates. Then I've got a couple WTF stories. Both of these are wild. Both of them are Canadian WTF stories. Sometimes I have to pull into American Nope, we've got pure Canadiana for our WTF stories today. And Adam, did you watch the video on the one story?
No, I don't believe
Okay,
I
I'm
did.
glad you didn't. It's going to be
Okay.
like it's freaking wild, guys. So you're
No
definitely going to
way.
want to watch that. Don't worry, I'll share the audio with you guys. Then our main stories of the day that we're going to be covering is the shame of the COVIDians, and that's from the Brownstone Institute. We're also going to be looking at the anti-hate material Saskatchewan is trying to banish from their schools. Then we're going to be reviewing what's wrong with Bill C-11, and then finally we're going to be talking about how to think about value, money, and price. And then just a little teaser here in the second half of the show. I'm going to be jumping into some of my most favorite essays, sharing with you guys the big takeaways. So if you guys are libertarian, if you're curious about Bitcoin, if you're just wondering how can we actually get white pilled and try and improve the future rather than just accept, that by 2030 we'll own nothing and we'll apparently be happy. Well, we're going to get deep into that in the second half of the show. But let's get started, do a few of these previous story updates, and we will roll from there. So first things first, Bank of Canada hikes rate again to 3.75%. So for those of you that weren't paying attention to what this means, essentially we saw a 50 basis point hike. This is also the sixth time this year that the Bank of Canada has raised rates. For some reason, my mouse isn't working. Well, that is concerning. But okay, well, I can't seem to scroll in the CBC article, so we're going to keep riding here. Jumping over to True North now, and just an update around the Emergencies Act. So day 9 recap of Emergencies Act hearings. Fed had planned to meet truckers before invoking Emergencies Act. And as I mentioned throughout this, there really isn't like one smoking gun here or one like silver bullet that I think is going to take down Trudeau. And I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing because there seems to be like a huge amount of evidence, in my opinion. But again, they're all like, well, you guys exaggerated on this. You lied about that. You misinterpreted this other thing. And so I am really curious to see how this all plays out. But let's get into specifically what they did wrong today. Oh, and I see we've got another spammer, so I'm going to quickly block them on YouTube first in the comments. But we do appreciate the spam comments because without
Already
them,
blocked.
we'd almost have no comments. So, anyways, jumping into this article, this is a direct quote here. Did you know that the cabinet and incidents response group of the political executive was meeting and that your proposal was provided to them? Miller asked Bowden. No, Bowden responded. Miller closed his questioning by informing Bowden it was. I can tell you that. And then they invoked the Emergencies Act. The testimony indicates that the federal government was given a choice to engage protest leaders in dialogue or pursue last resort emergency measures to quash the protest. Justin Trudeau's government ultimately chose the latter option. An email exchange between Stewart and Bowden indicated that Stewart was concerned about the safety of meeting with convoy leaders, asking Bowden in an email, would the person going to the meeting be putting themselves at risk? Bowden testified that it wasn't a concern to him and there wasn't a pile of risk there. Now, I can't help but think that this is all framed in such a way to try, like when they were sending out these emails, they were hoping to get different responses so that they could build up additional evidence. Now, if there was any risk, couldn't we just mitigate that? Like, couldn't you just have the negotiator roll deep with a dozen or 100 RCMP officers if you so chose, or OPP, versus just being like, well, it's kind of risky, so we're not going to take it. Or why not have them come to you? There's so many different ways this could have played out. And at least based upon what we saw, an outsider looking in while this was live occurring in Canada, it seemed like really the protesters desperately wanted to talk to government officials and at least voice their concerns. And ideally, they wanted to see results from their concerns being voiced. But how could you really expect any results if the government's never going to interact or talk with you? So again, this is a very thorough update. I love what True North is doing here. So I encourage you guys to jump into our Telegram chat where we share all the links. But quickly here, Adam, in regards to the Emergencies Act, any thoughts you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, it's just this is a very show that like we're extremely soft at this point in our police force and everything else. Like if they're afraid to go and talk to peaceful protesters, I don't know. I think we've got deeper issues inside our police force and our CMP and Parliament. So,
yeah, it. I think, unfortunately, even circling back to a quote I think we shared yesterday. Unfortunately, this quote was from one of Joseph Stalin's like top commanders, but essentially like, "Show me the man, and I'll show you the crime." I can't help but feel like that was the case here, where they decided they wanted the Emergencies Act enacted because it would make the protesters look like bad guys, right? Like, well, it's the first time in history we've had to enact the Emergencies Act against protesters, so these protesters must be bad people. And honestly, it feels like that's the level of simplicity we exist with in our political framework these days. Next, from National Newswatch, irreparable harm will occur if Doug Ford testifies at inquiry, Ford's lawyers say. This is fascinating to me because like this makes me more curious about what sort of testimony was going to come out of Doug Ford. The fact that his lawyers are saying that he shouldn't be allowed to testify here.
What the hell does that mean? That's very fascinating, Matt.
So we're going to get into this at least a little bit. And honestly, I hate. Let's cover the story first, and then I'll share with you what I hate about all this. Toronto, Doug Ford's government is arguing irreparable harm will occur if summons for the Ontario Premier to testify at the Emergencies Act inquiry is not quashed, court documents show. A judicial review application filed with federal court on Tuesday, Ontario's Attorney General cited parliamentary privilege as the reason Ford and then Solicitor General Sylvia Jones cannot testify at the hearing taking place in Ottawa. Quick little tangent here, but we saw this previously with the Emergencies Act, right? And we even saw an OPP official cite parliamentary privilege when they're not even part of the caucus in the Liberal government. And it's so frustrating to see government officials constantly trying to hide behind the language of the law rather than the intentions of the law here. And at this moment in time, maybe there is something very damning that if he was like under oath and had to give testimony here, that like Doug Ford would incriminate himself or Justin Trudeau or the mayor of Ottawa or who knows what else. But I want to know this. This is actually freaking important, right? Like this shit matters. Further on in the article, the Constitution privilege, which the Supreme Court has confirmed is of central importance to the Canadian legal system as a whole, will be breached and the application will become moot. Parliamentary privilege prevents members of the Ontario Legislative Assembly from being compelled to testify in any proceeding while the legislature is in session and for 40 days before and after each session. The application said this includes periods where the House is adjourned. Now, I'm not going to lie. I'm definitely no expert when it comes to how politics in Canada work. I think that I'm probably at average or slightly above average, but who knows? Maybe I'm mistaken there. But this seems like once we're looking at this gives them a lot of leeway. If literally 40 days before the legislative assembly and 40 days after, or when it's open, you can't be compelled to give this sort of testimony. It makes me wonder, like, do we ever actually hold politicians accountable here in Canada? There's a few other great points in this article from the Canadian Press I encourage you guys to check out. But we're going to keep rolling here. I want to jump to this next update. This is from Spencer Fernando. Trudeau cabinet again abstains on motion denouncing China's treatment of the Uyghurs as genocide. Now, this is a big deal here. And it's a big deal for a multitude of reasons. But the biggest thing that frustrates me about this, and we'll get into it in a different story update in a second, but even in regards to Adidas canceling their contract with Kanye with Ye, it there's so much virtue signaling these days, and yet at the same time, when government is actually given the opportunity to try and enforce policies that would be a net benefit, right, or at least recognize some of the atrocities that are going on in China, it seems like our government's not actually serious. So jumping into the article here from Spencer Fernando, in a motion to reaffirm that Canada views China's persecution of the Uyghurs as a genocide and provide support to help Uyghur refugees, the Liberal cabinet once again abstained as they did when the issue came up previously. The motion passed unanimously with support of opposition MPs and many Liberal backbenchers. So first things first, understand that the vast majority of Parliament agrees on this, but not a well, we'll get into this in a second, but essentially not a single person in Justin Trudeau's cabinet actually would even comment on this. They would neither say yay or nay. And this is honestly the coward's way out. Now, I understand complex geopolitical things going on here, right? Ideally, our government's playing 3D chess here by avoiding a open conflict with the CCP. But think about it. Right now, we have to funnel millions, it's in the billions now, of dollars to Ukraine to apparently try and stop the genocide, I'm using air quotes here, that is constantly claimed the Russians are committing against Ukraine. Well, if literally, and we've never even had a vote on that in Parliament, I don't think, whether it's a genocide or not. However, here in regards to China, we've got the majority of Parliament agreeing, the Liberal cabinet abstaining, and they abstain. Why? It's so frustrating. So getting further on, but in what can be seen as a clear signal to China, the Liberal cabinet left the chamber rapidly to avoid even being present for the vote. They didn't have the guts to either vote in favor of the motion or vote against it. And when, for a brief, hopeful moment, it seemed the lone Liberal cabinet minister showed some courage and voted for the motion, it turned out to have been a mistake. Clearly, one person in the cabinet, by make apparently, voted yay, and then immediately afterwards asked essentially for an undo, where they then asked for the Parliament to recognize that they wanted to change their vote. That was a mistake, voting yay on this. And actually, props to Parliament, they didn't. And again, props to the Liberal backbenchers that are willing to speak up on this and like probably take a political hit within their own party in regards to denouncing what's going on with the CCP and the Uyghurs. It's so frustrating in this day and age to see constant politicking, talking out both sides of your mouth. They don't actually care about these issues. They just care about staying in power, and they care about making life easier for themselves. And they, in this case, is literally the Liberal cabinet, in my opinion. Thoughts here, Adam?
Yeah, I mean, this just screams like political capture to me. And I know we've covered in the past, we've covered the fact that like the CCP has a bunch of essentially like offices in Canada
Police
that
stations
are allegedly to be spying on the Chinese citizens that are in Canada. And like, I can't imagine these things are not all related. And so like the dark path here is just like one of political capture where it's like, and again, we've also covered that Justin Trudeau has openly and publicly stated that he really adores China's culture of authoritarianism because they can get shit done fast. And like, I just can't help but connect all these dots and just think like, if nothing else, it's a crazy coincidence that we would be willing to take on somebody like Russia, but not take on somebody like China, and what sort of political implications there are to that. And I do think it's extraordinarily cowardly for the Liberal cabinet to just not participate in a vote that seems very cut and dry, obviously, to the rest of Parliament.
And if they disagree with it, then vote against it, right? Like,
Yes.
again, I'm not even saying you have to vote for this, but to not vote for the entire cabinet to abstain
I
does
just
seem
like,
cowardly.
I honestly, that the whole notion of being able to abstain to me doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, it should be very clear to your constituents, to your civilians in the country, like where are these parties actually standing on any of the issues that we consider important enough to bring to Parliament. Like, the idea that they can just all not participate, like that to me is so wild. Like, what other situation would that exist in?
Well, and certainly I would like answers at least if you're going to abstain, right? Like literally lay it out for us why you're doing this. And I think obviously they're never going to do that because it would probably cost them political points. It would make them look bad. And again, these days politics is all about the looks, right? Like it's all about how you frame things. It's not about the actual substance. And at this point in time, I want steak, not sizzle when it comes to politicians. Jumping over here to the Western Standard, we're going to be briefly, I got to get back up here, briefly talking about Adidas cut ties with Ye over anti-Semitic comments, loses billionaire status. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, but just real briefly, I want to highlight for you guys what this is all about. His personal fortune is likely to take a hit, with his net worth dropping from $2 billion to $400 million. I know other people have said it's $600 million. Who really knows the exact details here? But understand, Balenciaga, Gap, JP Morgan Chase cut ties with him after his anti-Semitic remarks. Creative artist agencies stopped representing them, and now we've seen Adidas essentially pulling this contract as well. Now, I understand based upon like my little bit of research, he's probably going to get a $250 million payment from Adidas because they cut this. So again, who knows? Maybe Ye wanted this all to happen, but regardless, I think this is important to highlight here right now. The hypocrisy that's playing out, right? How many CEOs of corporations that literally use Uyghur forced labor in China to make their products, right? Back in 2020, it was discovered that Adidas was doing that. So this company, like, understand that Ye's words are more dangerous, apparently, to our country and our institutions than actual actions by corporations and their corporate leaders. And we should care about this stuff, at least on a gradient scale, right? Again, I'm not saying that you have to be pro Ye here, but you should understand that comments are different than actions. And again, his comments, most of them, I would argue, are kind of clumsy, and it's often taken out of context. I personally still find him a fascinating character. I don't necessarily agree with every word that comes out of his mouth, but I do believe he should be able to say them as long as he's not directly inciting violence. And it frustrates me to no end. Like, how many corporations currently bank with JP Morgan that are multinational corporations that are using labor in China or other Southeast Asian countries, right? Where there is forced labor occurring. Well, I'm willing to bet it's more than zero. And yet they don't give a shit about those situations, either because it doesn't align with their politics, or maybe because there's a mass conspiracy like Ye has kind of alluded to in previous comments. Honestly, this should be shocking, and this should be a wake-up call for everyone. Understand, just because you have a bunch of money in your bank, just because on paper you look to be wealthy, really, are you wealthy if at a moment in time cancel culture can try and rip that all away from you, right? And we also saw the crazy lawsuit that's coming out against Ye in regards to his comments about George Floyd. Previously, based upon most people's understanding of the law in the States, you can't defame a dead person. But the claim here is they're essentially saying that it's causing grievance and harm to George Floyd's daughter. Again, the fact that a man can just say a handful of words and society will completely rally against him when there's actual people taking real actions that have real consequences, and we turn a blind eye to it. It really shows us, in my opinion, what our society prioritizes: virtue signaling versus actually having virtue.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like free speech is only really free when it's convenient.
Well,
so
and we're going to get up to that in a second, Adam, because
okay.
that's a sign of white supremacy.
Oh,
So that's in a
Jesus.
future story today.
God damn it.
All right.
My
Well, I'm going to
mistake.
keep rolling here because these are still just our show updates. But this next one, in focus. Oh, let's get rid of that, hopefully. I got paywalled here because I didn't refresh. But focus, JCCF. Let me see if I can quickly.
I think for this one, you just need to turn off your ad blocker.
Yeah, I'm willing to die on that hill, Adam. So we're going to quickly change our history settings, and hopefully that doesn't delete my highlights here.
In the meantime, while you're kind of sorting through there, one thing that I was thinking about while you were covering the Doug Ford story, and I know this is a bit of a callback now, like 3-4 stories ago, but I was reminded actually of this story of this gentleman named Daniel Rigmaiden. And Daniel Rigmaiden was this really interesting hacker that he did a lot of bad shit. He essentially defrauded and stole from a lot of people, but generally speaking, like, he never harmed anybody truly. But he actually uncovered secret spying technology that the government was using with what was called a Stingray technology. So I can't help but wonder if there's more to the story with the Doug Ford thing, because like, I think you're on the right path saying like he might be incriminating himself or Justin Trudeau, or there could be something else a play, right? Like maybe they were using a different type of technology for spying on the people that were there, or any type of breach of privacy or things like that would have broader social issues. Anyways,
Well, and
random thought.
we already know the RCMP stated that they were monitoring social media, right? And like
Yeah.
again, that could mean a lot
But
of
what does that
different
mean?
things. Yeah. And I guess the only thing I'll say is the fact that we've got the Ottawa mayor, right, and Trudeau going forward and talking and giving testimony, but not Doug Ford. It makes me think that either he wasn't fully in support of these measures, or he wanted half measures in that regards, or maybe he extremely wanted them. Like, I think that either way, he's trying to protect himself from his political base. Okay, I got my cache cleared here. In focus, JCCF on federal court decision to strike down legal challenge of COVID travel mandates. So, what I just want to highlight here is again, this is in regards to the case that we've talked about previously about the mootness that's essentially framed in regards to whether the government was justified here. So, the government's lawyers are saying the case should not go forward because the COVID-19 travel restriction measures have been suspended, but the government and Trudeau said their draconian measures can come back. It's a denial of justice in the public, and it is in the public's interest for the court to hear this case. That's why we are going to appeal this and hope for a fair hearing. Yeah, unfortunately, I got rid of some of my highlights here, but there was one other point I wanted to highlight. But okay, yeah. So the travel mandate represents one of the most egregious infringements of Canadians' mobility rights in Canadian history, and in our view, striking the lawsuit out before it's heard, and while the Prime Minister continues to threaten Canadians with further COVID restrictions, is a grave injustice. This is important to understand, right? Because again, if we don't review it now, it means they can at least get away with it one more time. And think about how long it took for this court case to actually come to a hearing. By the time it came to a hearing, they had canceled it. So what's what's left for us other than to assume they might try and do this literally again? You know, enforce restrictions again this fall or this winter, and then undo them come spring, and we won't get a court case again because mootness. It's no longer at play. We should understand whether the actions of our government are justified or not. It shouldn't matter about the timing of that investigation. Um, Jumping over to Timcast here, judge ends New York's vaccine mandate for city workers. Court finds the mayor's vaccine mandates arbitrary and capricious. The health commissioner cannot terminate employees. The mayor cannot exempt certain employees from these orders. Judge Purizo wrote in his opinion. Executive Order number 62 renders all of these vaccine mandates arbitrary and capricious. The vaccination mandate for city employees was not just about safety and public health, it was about compliance. If it was about safety and public health, unvaccinated workers would have been placed on leave the moment the order was issued, he explained. In a city with a nearly 80% vaccination rate, we shouldn't be penalizing the people who showed up to work at great risk to themselves and their families while we were locked down. And this is important, right? Because again, at least we're finding out that what New York did was wrong according to their own courts. Canada, we don't apparently deserve the understanding of justice here as long as the government cancels what they did before they get around to. Like, again, imagine if the Emergencies Act was cited on mootness. Like, that would just, I think that would honestly trigger likely a whole nother convoy and major protest in Ottawa. And for anyone that actually cares either about justice or just trying to get our country back to functioning the way it used to pre-pandemic, like these things have to be brought up. They have to be explored. Even if we disagree with the final review of the courts, at least we'll understand that the courts are backing our political elites versus caring about justice.
Well, it's just interesting. Like, Matt, let's just say I kidnap you from your place of work. I torture you and beat you to the point where you can't possibly work and you can't possibly socialize because you're so badly beaten. And then you eventually heal to the point where you can go back to work and start socializing. And then we go to court because I've just assaulted you to near death and tortured you. And then the court just goes, no, it's kind of moot because you're back to work. Like, you actually healed, right? Like, there was no real long lasting damage. And you're like, well, no, but I was assaulted. Like, I was literally beaten and tortured. And they're like, yeah, but are you being tortured right now or beaten right now in this court? Are you being raped right now? And it's like, well, no, but hold on. Isn't that not the point of what we're trying to do here? It's like, did this happen or did it not? And that's what we're trying to prove. Are we innocent or guilty?
And was it justified or not?
And was it?
Yeah.
Exactly. So that, like, to me, I honestly don't see a real difference in that logical flow. And so to me, it's like, if that's moot, then everything's moot, right? Because like most crimes are not going to be continuous forever, except with the exception of maybe a murder or something where you can't take it back. Like to me, that it's just like if you follow this through, like that, okay, our justice system's moot then.
Yeah, it's very frustrating to find ourselves at this moment in time. Now let's jump over to our first WTF story of the day. This one, like, this one's probably just bureaucracy gone awry, but it should be frustrating for the average person because, again, the government, the police, they don't actually care about you. They care about protecting themselves and following their rules. So this is courtesy of the Western Standard. Calgary cops seize stolen truck, leave drugs inside, owner stuck with towing bill. So not sure if you had a chance to check this out, Adam, but essentially I'm going to summarize how this played out. So dude gets his truck stolen. Seems shitty, right? Later on, I forget the exact timeline, but let's say a week later, he's going through a drive-through of a restaurant with his wife in his wife's vehicle, and across the street, he sees his truck. He's like, oh shit, that's my stolen truck. So, like a good citizen, rather than just go get the truck, he calls the police. The police say don't touch it because it's related to a crime. The police go tow it to their impound lot, then charge him $320 and leave the drugs and different things from the criminals in his truck. And he was like, why didn't I just go and take my truck back? And like, it really begs the question, like, why should a citizen like try and help the police if the police are just going to follow the letter of the law rather than what I would assume is the intention of the law, right? Like, it's so bizarre that this dude essentially solves the crime because you know the police aren't going to like track down the actual criminals that stole this truck, and he has to foot the bill for it.
Yeah, that's wild, man. Like at the very least, like have him prove ownership and then be like, okay, dude, here's your truck back. And like, what's up with the
don't
leaving the
charge
drugs in it?
Like, again, it seems weird that the victim of a crime is being charged by the government, in particular because he's the one that actually solved the crime. I don't know. Maybe I'm just old fashioned here, but I'm going to pull up my screen share here. We're going to share audio because Adam and you guys watching this right now need to hear this next video. This one's a freaking doozy. This is from the Toronto Sun. Innocent woman almost killed while ordering chicken burger. So this happened in downtown Toronto, I believe. It was around 12:49 a.m. Saturday at a Wendy's on Queen Street, a few blocks west of Spadina. And I literally can't believe that this was caught on camera. So first things first, Adam, if the audio is very, very low on your end, just let me know because I want to make sure you guys can hear this.
Okay.
You ready?
Yep, bring it up. I can't wait for this. Oh, you're not sharing yet. Matt, you're not sharing yet.
Oh, it wasn't. Well, it is sharing the audio technically. Oh, I'm not sharing it.
Yeah, you're not sharing. Right.
You should have spoken up sooner. But okay, guys.
I think there's a leg.
All right, you guys ready? Let's watch this again. It's worth the suspense. Trust me. All right, guys can see it. Hopefully, you can hear it.
We literally got there and we were inside. I was like, what?
Anyways, hi. Can I get the spicy chicken burger? What the fuck was that?
We need to leave.
How wild is that?
Whoa.
Like, she's literally like just ordering her burger. Can I get the spicy chicken burger or whatever? And like holding her camera just awkwardly. And it catches the stray bullet. You literally see the glass shatter and like hit her shirt. And like just insane. Now, thankfully, we all know Justin Trudeau's handgun ban would have stopped that because I'm sure the criminal has registered that handgun and just accidentally took it out.
They're already banned, so I don't know how this possibly could have happened. Like,
oh, true, it was already enforced. Yeah,
absolutely. I don't know. This is impossible. What the fuck? What?
But
it's like, a doctored video. This is
thankfully
impossible.
Like at least no one in this video was hurt. But I just like it took me back, right? Like one, I think for the average Canadian, this is something you expect to see in the United States, not in Canada. And two, to actually just capture it on camera. And like, I'm not sure if you could hear it, Adam, but like you hear one gunshot first before the second gunshot that actually like broke through the glass. Just absolutely wild. And there's no lessons here other than just WTF.
Although I'm pretty sure, I don't know if you've ever been to that like area, that McDonald's is pretty shifty.
Sure.
Yeah.
It still doesn't change this at all from a crazy WTF story, in my opinion. Let's jump over to the first main, or actually, before I jump into the first main story of the day, guys, any recommendations you wanted to share with the audience, Adam?
In terms of recommendations, I would say I just recently listened to a Lex Friedman podcast with a lady from MIT, and I found that to be really interesting. They were talking about AI and just some of the robot stuff that's going on, and they do brush up a little bit on. Her name's Kate Darling, and they're talking about social robots, ethics, privacy, and essentially the future of robotics, and definitely just like a fascinating exploration of technology. And I have one more thing here. I'm just going to bring up a screen share because I had this saved from yesterday and I forgot to share my screen. So there we go. Boom, boom, boom. Really quick update here. But NASA, following my recommendation from, I believe, last week on the Ryan Graves episode on Joe Rogan Experience, NASA just announced its unidentified aerial phenomena research team to examine these mysterious sightings. And so I was mentioning the Navy pilot Ryan Graves and his experiences with these unidentified aerial phenomenon. And like some of them are just absolutely incredible. So this is an article by inverse.com. So I'm sure if you Google NASA, yep.
Quick question there, Adam. I haven't read it yet, but I just read the first line.
Yeah.
A 16-person team, including an astronaut, a space treaty drafter, a boxer, and several astrobiologists. I guess I'm curious, why is a boxer involved in this?
Well, obviously, if we have to fight these guys, like if these are aliens,
hand-to-hand combat in a ring comes down, we need to make sure we've got a boxer on the team.
Well,
just seems interesting choice of framing. But it makes me think they're taking this very seriously.
No, but they actually are. If you read through the shit, there's actually some really interesting names on here. Like one of them is Scott Kelly, who is actually a Canadian astronaut who's been in space many times. I think he's potentially been the he is the astronaut who's been in space for the longest number of total days. And anyways, this team is just littered with people like astrophysicists, oceanographer, which I think is fun because in the UAP stories, we've heard a lot of accounts that they're transmedium. So like accounts of like these unidentified aerial phenomena going from the sky, like going from air into the ocean and then coming back out of the ocean at like speeds that just are unexplainable by our common knowledge of physics. So I mean, at the very least, like it's cool. I don't know what it means, but I'm glad there's a team looking into it. And it sounds like based on Ryan Graves' account that like this is actually fairly important for the people flying around in the air because they've had some really near miss encounters with these objects, whatever they are. And they were considering like loss of life or at least loss of aircraft if they were to hit some of these things. So whatever the hell they are, I hope that someday in our lifetime we'll find out, Matt.
I just feel like they shouldn't have a boxer on the panel. They should have brought in an MMA specialist, and that MMA specialist should have been Joe Rogan. That would make me trust it.
Fuck, dude. If Joe Rogan was on this panel, the whole world would be doomed because like the news would be out tomorrow.
All right. Well, let's jump into the first main story of the day I want to explore with you guys. This is courtesy of the Brownstone Institute. This one written by Thomas Harrington. And I just thought it was a worthwhile exploration here. So the shame of the COVIDians. And I think, as we kind of move into whatever the next phase of the narrative is going to be, I personally think that what's laid out here in this article is likely going to hit home a lot more than I'd like it to. But here we are. And thus was born a pact of silence, one of millions established each day across the world. Shame is an incredibly powerful emotion, one that when imposed by parents or certain authority figures in very, very limited doses in the process of a child's trajectory towards adulthood, which is to say the process through which he or she begins to generate an autonomous sense of morality, can serve a certain educational purpose. And once its lessons have been internalized in the adult, it can serve as a brake upon the well-known human tendency to get carried away and do stupid, regrettable things. Much less talked about is the way it can lead to people to paralysis or flat-out lying and the short circuiting of mindful behavior. With all that with all that last term implies as far as responding compassionately to those we care about or those we may have, if even inadvertently harmed. And again, it's worth reading the entire article here, but just want to highlight some key points. And so they do what many people do when they feel the world as they know it is slipping away. They pretend it is not happening and point fingers everywhere but at themselves, inventing malign stories about those who, unlike them, have enough ego detachment to analyze the world more or less as it is, as opposed to what their ill-resolved identity conflicts and status hungers need it to be. So the reason I thought this was important to highlight is, even as we see the Emergencies Act inquiry playing out here in Canada, even as we see the mootness being cited in regards to vaccine mandates here in Canada, I think it's important to understand that at least there probably is a handful of individuals, maybe it's more than a handful of individuals, that used to be very pro lockdowns and pro the science, pro never asking any real insightful questions. And they're going to begin to feel shame. And there's two ways that they can choose to really harness that shame. They could choose to use it to try and look deep within themselves, detach themselves from their ego, and ask hard questions about how they could be fooled or how they could essentially be captured by the hysteria around the COVID narrative. Or they could choose to double down and choose to protect the lie, to create pacts of silence in order to try and avoid the consequences that they probably knowingly believe should apply to themselves. And I do fear it's going to be the latter.
Oh yeah, I mean, in this case, I'm almost certain of that. Like the people in my life that were most steadfast on the lockdowns and, moving at the speed of science despite any type of data, showing the contrary to what was happening. Like those people in my life have certainly not come around yet. I mean, there are some people maybe on Instagram that I've talked to that were like, oh yeah, like I kind of got captured, but I think that person is considerably more courageous, right, than the average person. And the average person will fold. They'll fold under the pressure. They'll fold under the shame. They will opt for silence because it will be easier than dealing with the actual underlying issue that they got duped. And this is something we've been talking about for 2 years, right? And this is why I thought it was so important to have shows like what you did with the maple pill was brilliant. And I always felt it was important to continue sharing my position because what that allowed me to do over the course of the last 2 years was accumulate allies that came out of the woodwork seemingly, and there were people that felt like they were given permission to speak out loud about what we were kind of all thinking in the group of people that share my opinion on this stuff. And those that kind of cowered away or disappeared, I don't think they'll ever come back and apologize, right? Or even just state that they were wrong. And I think that's going to be encouraged by the government too, as they continue to double down. Like Justin Trudeau's statements on the whole lockdown and use of the Emergency Act is that it must have happened. It had to have happened. It absolutely needed to happen, or we would have all died. And you're like, well, that's not what the data says. But they will be stuck on that path because it's political suicide at the very least if they don't. And so I believe that the people that are going to cower in silence will use that as a reference when they choose that path.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, it's a complex conversation, and we had part of it yesterday. But what do you decide to do with the individuals if they are found to be at fault, right? What sort of consequences? How do we try and move forward? I don't think we're smart enough to solve it here in 1 or 2 live streams, but it needs to be a thought, at least, that everyone's exploring at this moment in time, or else we are absolutely doomed to repeat history on this. Jumping over to the second story of the day, this is from the National Post. Inside the anti-hate materials, Saskatchewan is trying to ban this from schools. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, and anyone that cares about the culture wars, I strongly encourage you to spend some time and read through this article thoroughly. There's a link again in our Telegram chat. You can join for free. You get all the links. You can see everything that we're citing here. And honestly, it's even hard to know where to begin. I'm mainly just going to hit the main points here because otherwise we'd spend all day chatting about this. But the package claims with minimal evidence, and so this is essentially a package that was put together that's to be pushed out to the public schools, and Saskatchewan's pushing back and doesn't want to do it. I think hundreds of thousands of dollars was spent on it. The package claims with minimal evidence that Canadian schools are battlegrounds for hate. Direct quote here: because schools are hubs of our communities, they have become battlegrounds for hate-motivated organizations, it reads. What the report does not do is provide much context as to the actual size of the Canadian hate movement. It reports that an alarming number of Canadians attended 2017 Charlottesville, even though only 2 Canadians are known to have attended. Well, at this moment in time, are we literally saying that anything above 0 is an alarming number of Canadians? Because technically, guys, just a reminder, there's over 30 million of us. There's probably going to be a couple oddballs or screw looses in that group. And I don't think that they necessarily stick to only one political agenda. I think it's far reaching. Further on, this isn't entirely off-brand for Canadian Anti-Hate Network, and this is in regards to a lot of the BS, in my opinion, that the Anti-Hate Network pushes. We've talked about previously how they essentially used mis and disinformation to push a narrative about the truckers that then was picked up by CBC, that then was picked up by our politicians in our parliament. This isn't entirely off-brand for the Canadian Anti-Hate Network. On its website, the group has a bit of a habit of citing threats from hate groups that are occasionally just a poorly constructed social media page with a handful of followers. Did you know Canada's pre-1965 flag is indeed dubbed a hate symbol? And this is the complete rewriting of history that all of us should be concerned about. So again, just in case you didn't know, that's a hate symbol. I mean, if you were to show me that or the swastika or the red fist or the hammer and sickle, I'd be like, they're the same photo, bro. I can't even tell the difference here.
Oh,
Okay.
man. You get
Continuing on, the materials get it wrong in describing the 2018 Toronto van attack. And this is important to understand, right? So the 2018 van attack, which killed 10 people, is cited as evidence that Canada is susceptible to violent extremism by incels. And this is going to be a buzzword you hear time and time again in the future. Groups of misogynist men who blame their celibacy on women. Attacker Alec Minison cited his beliefs that women should be punished for not wanting to be sexually active with him, it reads. There's just one problem. It came out during trial that this admission never really happened, that Minison wasn't an incel, and that he was mostly motivated by a desire for notoriety. Nevertheless, Minison's case is twice cited in the toolkit, including a section claiming that misogyny is a way to attract and unite people of color to hate groups. Again, let's even think about that. Misogyny is attracting and uniting people of color to hate groups. Are people of color more prone to hating women? Like, it's just so bizarre. Like, a lot of this anti-racist rhetoric turns out to actually kind of be a little bit racist when you scratch below the surface. And it's just wild that they feel so comfortable saying this. This is one of my complaints about whenever there's a tragedy that occurs, like a mass casualty situation, where immediately they try and frame it as incels, white supremacists, hate groups, like any sort of identifier. Again, there's often just fucked up people in this world, and they do fucked up shit for a multitude of different fucked up reasons.
Yes, we even saw this here in London, Ontario, our home city that we're based out of, where there was a incident, a motor vehicle like homicide. Essentially, the guy drove into a few different people, and instantly the police said it was racist, but never once ever. So this was like, it was pushed by every news outlet at all, like anywhere in Canada. And never once was there any evidence that he had said that. Never once was there any evidence that he had said that in the past online. There was literally zero evidence presented that was in fact the case.
Yeah, and just to build upon that, again, like, we haven't been provided any evidence, as Adam was mentioning. And second, we haven't actually had the court case play out yet. So, like, I hate this jumping to conclusions, because it's not that I don't believe that there's bad, hateful people out there. But I think we should be very specific in our language, right? And we should focus on actually calling out bad actors rather than like bad actors in regards to their hate versus attributing hate to every single bad actor. There is a difference there. Mere usage of popular social media channels are cited as a red flag. So again, teachers are told to be on the lookout for students' usage of TikTok and Telegram. We already had a call to action to join our Telegram chat, so presumably we're a hate-oriented media as well here, which is just wild. And remember when Canadians got mad at weeks-long anti-pipeline blockades? That was a hate crime as well. Further on, quoting internet memes are cited as far-right symbols. So again, if you've ever used the Mega Chad, the Trad Girl, or the Wojak, that's a hate symbol. You're not just having humor, it's hateful humor. And the phrase, "this is a free speech issue," is cited as a common defense for hate propaganda. So this is what frustrates me to no end, this desire to tear down free speech. Bad ideas deserve the light of day so we can shine light on it and tear down those bad ideas rather than trying to sweep them under the rug. I don't believe that you're actually going to solve anything if people feel like they can't explore these ideas. Daryl Cooper makes an excellent example on one of his podcast episodes about how people get pushed towards extremism. And the example he cites here is, let's say that there's, a 10, 11, 12-year-old, a grade 5 or 6er that goes to school and learns about the communist revolution, right? And a lot of the atrocities that were done against their own citizenry, right? Like the Holodomor. And let's say he Googles and he stumbles across a internet forum, maybe it's on 4chan, and he finds someone that says, it turns out there was a disproportionate number of Jews in the intellectia and in the leadership of the communist movement in Russia. Let's say he goes to his teacher and asks that, and his teacher tells him he's hateful and that that's wrong and that's inappropriate. He gets a letter sent home to his parents. His parents, lecture him as well. And yet no one actually disputes the facts. And so what ends up happening is the kid becomes radicalized because he's like, well, if they're lying to me about this, what else are they lying to me about? I bet that 4chaners telling only the truth. And that's how you find yourself slowly being pulled towards radicalization. And it's literally the policies that are enacted to try and stop radicalization, in my opinion at least, that often lead towards that radicalization because people don't feel comfortable. They don't feel permitted to have these open, honest discourses, right? Again, think back to Adidas and all the canceling of Kanye West right now. It'd be much better for people just cite facts and be like, no, it turns out Jewish actors don't control the entire media, or they don't control Hollywood, and cite facts and statistics rather than simply be like, we must cancel him at all costs because he said bad thing. Anything here, Adam, you want to add?
Yeah, no, I think the ability to have more discourse and the ability to have better ideas beating worse ideas is obviously the solution. And anything else is just to flex, for the same reason that you'll never hear anybody that's high ranking in a corporation or in the military or anything like that, just handing out orders, like you will do this, right? Without providing an explanation or providing context for the mission and why we're actually doing that. Because everybody knows that is literally the worst way to do leadership. And the same thing will work for ideas, right? Just simply stomping out ideas and using straw man arguments, will never hold up to free speech and additional discourse. I firmly believe in that. Even if the ideas are shit, I think they should be, played out. And we saw this too with Matt Ridley's writings on how ideas have sex, right? Even bad ideas can be useful when we talk about them out loud, because often those ideas get to percolate. And even if they weren't right for a particular context, maybe they are right in additional context. So free speech. I'm a huge proponent of that.
Absolutely. And talking about free speech and being clamped down here in Canada, it's a perfect segue into the next story here, Kill Bill C-11. And honestly, I think a lot of Canadians are just fatigued with all these different censorship bills, but they don't know what to do. They don't know how to participate. So I strongly encourage you guys become just a little bit informed about what's going on. As the website highlights, Bill C-11 is a direct threat to our online freedom. The government claims this bill is about supporting Canadian culture and leveling the playing field. In effect, Bill C-11 will put in place an internet czar, the CRTC, who will pick which content gets moved to the top of the screen menu and which content gets pushed to page 53, where it will never be discovered. This will be based on arbitrary set of criteria suspiciously absent from the bill. And this is one of the biggest problems with all these freaking bills that the Liberals have been trying to push through recently, is that they often don't even lay out the details. And so it's so hard to debate these issues when they're just like, no, we're not going to do that. And it's like, well, it says that technically you could, but we won't. Well, why should we trust you? Why should we ever by default trust the government? The government should always have to justify their actions to us before moving forward on an issue, particularly an issue this important. Honestly, I have no doubt that there will be massive consequences on important social media platforms like YouTube if this bill passes. It's why we've seen Alphabet and YouTube push back on these policies against the Canadian government. We've got Facebook threatening to pull news essentially from Canada if we were to proceed with this bill. But if you guys want to dig deep into the subject matter, there's a lot of different information here. I just want to highlight one here. So this is a study. I've got it up here. This is from, I believe it was the Canadian Taxpayer Association or Federation. Yeah. So the Canadian Taxpayer Federation here. And specifically, just want to highlight a couple of the aspects of what does Bill C-11 do. But again, spend some time, if you're so inclined, go read the entire 19 pages. Bill C-11 would establish a new class of regulated broadcaster called the online undertaking. Online undertakings will include any service that transmit programs over the internet in Canada. These new online undertakings would not be licensed per se, but they would face regulation from the CRT, including mandated registration, the possibility of mandated payments to support Canadian content production, discoverability requirements that would require online services promote Canadian content, mandatory disclosure of detailed confidential information, including algorithmic data, and the prospect of multi-million-dollar penalties for failure to comply that could be applied to any online undertaking, whether an internet giant or a small niche podcasting or gaming service. And one of the most beautiful things about the internet is it's opened up so much information. It's opened up so much public discourse. And we've seen from the day it existed, essentially, the government trying to clamp down and control that. And this is just one more step in that authoritarian march towards tyranny. And I fear that a version of this is going to pass. I honestly do, guys. And we need to bring more attention to it. We need to speak out more against this.
Yeah, I am fascinated by the idea you mentioned there just earlier about like Alphabet and Meta and those companies kind of speaking out against this, because it is interesting to just like, I guess, observe like how much influence can they exert? Like, because if they squish this, like, I bet that's like a big show of force from them. Because like left to their own devices, absolutely, the Liberals will pass this in a second. So I'm fascinated to see where this goes. I am also encouraged by some of these services and the accessibility of the services we have now, like ExpressVPN and NordVPN and like these other services that can allow us to more easily sort of mask your online presence and become a little bit more anonymous online. Things like the Brave browser and these VPNs that are available to us now at very low cost. So I'm encouraged by that. Like, obviously the free market, it generally speaking should always win. And obviously these products have come out as a response to that, right? People value privacy, people value freedom, people value freedom of speech. And so the things like the Brave browser and VPNs have been making like a huge, I would say, they've had a lot of adoption recently. And I think that's a response to shit like this, because it's not just Canada doing this, right?
No, it's a lot of Commonwealth countries, though. In particular, it's the UK, Australia, Canada, New Zealand that are pushing the boundaries. They're pushing forward in censorship here. We saw Australia have that spat, right, with Facebook around news outlets and payments and things of that nature. And there's real consequences here. And to your point, Adam, a lot of critics of Bill C-11 say that this will essentially necessitate VPN use in Canada if Canadians want to actually navigate the internet without essentially being dictated by the government what they're allowed to see. And while they hide behind the paper shield of protecting Canadian culture, understand these are the same bureaucrats, the same administrators, the same politicians that tell us that almost anything Canadian is racist. So what sort of Canadian culture are they going to push forward? It's only going to be shit from the CBC. It's only going to be woke bullshit. And we're not going to be shit like this will be considered not effective Canadian culture, or it'll be considered hate content. And so it'll be ranked. And we all live in a world of censorship from these large technology platforms, right? Like, you already can get banned on YouTube for a variety of things that I would argue should fall under free speech, but because of their terms of use, it doesn't, right? You already can get fact-checked or de-emphasized in Facebook's algorithm. Like, we literally saw that Joe Rogan and Mark Zuckerberg interview. This isn't the beginning, but this is one more step towards the end of free speech. And it's so important that people at least understand what's going on, right? I think far too many politicians believe that it's their job to dictate to us what we think. And this is one more step towards them being able to easily dictate what you think.
Yeah, it's tough to think that they're actually representing, the views or desires or wants and needs of the average Canadian citizen. Like, this doesn't feel like that. And again,
Absolutely.
any type of protectionism, like, guys, do a little bit of history. Look at the battle between Ford and Toyota. I believe it's in the 50s or 40s or something like that, where America just decided, like, okay, it's all about American auto manufacturing. That's what we must protect. And then Japan just comes in and sweepingly destroys them, because all that was happening is, by making these American manufacturing things, they negated their absolute and comparative advantages. And then Japan was like, well, we can just build all this shit with a greater quality for way cheaper and just export it over there. And then, like, their only response then was, okay, well, we have to tax the shit out of it. And it's like, well, you've actually just harmed everybody, right? Like, now you've just brought the cost of that lower cost, higher quality product up to parity with your American product for no reason other than to harm the average American citizen in order to have this protectionism of the auto manufacturing industry in America. And it's just like, damn, dude, like, none of this has ever worked. It never, literally has never worked. And we've been joking about the dairy industry here in Canada recently and stuff like that. It's just like, how can we not see that this is a lost cause? Like, let the free market do what the free market needs to do, which is compete.
Mm-hmm. And we won't have time today just because we went a little long, but I just wanted to highlight at least what was going to be our fourth story. This is from the Mises Institute, How to Think About Value, Money, and Price. And I think a lot of people never really scratch below the surface level of money, right? Like, money buys me shit. I work for money, and that's the end of the story when it comes to money. No, understand that through fiat currencies, right, we're regularly being robbed by our government. Think of right now what you're personally experiencing with inflation. Sure, supply chains, global conflicts, those things can impact inflation to a certain extent. But what becomes sticky inflation is usually a consequence of fiat currency policies. And so I think this is a great little introduction to it. It's an excerpt from a book, How to Think About the Economy, a primer. So encourage you guys, if you're so inclined, jump over, check it out. But what I want to talk about next year, guys, is what our second half of the show is going to be. So I understand a lot of times, a lot of the different discussion points we have here could probably feel a little black-pilled. When I get a little bit ranty, it definitely trends in the black pill direction versus the white pill. And so in the second half of today's show, and reminder, Wednesdays are usually about like politics, history, things of, public interest in that regards. We're going to be exploring an essay called Isaiah's Job, as well as an essay about Bitcoin maximalism in the remnant. And I think these are very important concepts that you won't accidentally learn about in the mainstream education system, and yet are absolutely crucial if we want to build a better future. So I really look forward to sharing that with you guys in the second half of the show. If you've enjoyed this show or previous shows, smash the like button, hit subscribe, jump in the comments section. We really do appreciate the feedback. If you think our content's so good that it's worth sharing, well, remember, sharing is caring, so we'd really appreciate that.
Yeah, awesome, Matt. I'm really excited for this discussion coming up here in a couple of minutes. And I guess just one tactical tip, if you haven't read it already, the Bitcoin Standard, and then the subsequent book, the Fiat Standard. So if you're interested in that Mises article, you may want to follow up with those couple pieces of content there. But with that being said, we'll see you guys back in 2.5 minutes.
They say life is what you make it. So what happens if you actually try? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually grind out when the time's right? What if you actually blinded by your hindsight? What if you actually find out what defines life? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? I'm getting 1% better every day. I'm getting 1% better every way. I'm waking up every day to a sunny day, no matter what the weather say. Life is like a record, so just let it play. Educate, motivate, entertain and demonstrate. Health, wealth, relationships and legacy we elevate. Every day is what you make it, so don't take it and waste it. Never too late to save it. Remember, roses grow from pavement. Let me break this down in layman's. Just wanna live outrageous, build my way to greatness. Gotta speak my truth and face it. Hear the basis lies, gotta challenge it and break it. Take a to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die, cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die, cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually grind out when the time's right? What if you actually blinded by your hindsight? What if you actually find out what defines life? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? I'm getting 1% better every day. I'm getting 1% better every way. I'm waking up every day to a sunny day. No matter what the weather say, life is like a record, so just let it play. Best Day Ever Media. Song by Dan the Lost Boy.
All right, guys, we're back. I'm excited to jump into the subject matter. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you two. It's hard to really rank your favorite essays, in my opinion, or favorite like political pamphlets or whatever you kind of want to frame this sort of content as. But they certainly rank up there as my favorites. I think they're extremely important, and I think they're very easy to overlook. But before we jump into this, I guess I want to share a quote with you guys and then ask you, Adam, a couple questions. So, even the most stout-hearted libertarian occasionally despairs of saving freedom. At such times, this essay may afford encouragement. And that was from Albert J. Nock. He's the author of the first essay we're going to be talking about, Isaiah's Job. But essentially, what I want to explore with you guys, and maybe start off here with you, Adam, is if I was to say to you that the average person doesn't matter, and particularly they don't matter when it comes to changing the world, changing society, would that feel a little bombastic?
Yeah, I guess in a sense, like I would think that would be a little bit bombastic, because you would think that like any person could be the average person, right? And so like if you took that thesis, I guess, to its like final conclusion, maybe like in that case, like nobody could ever matter. And that seems like, it seems like that can't be the case in a certain sense. Like I would think that at some point the average person becomes the exceptional person through some means of education or experience. And then, once that's occurred, like perhaps they can change the world, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely hear what you're saying there. And as we explore Albert J. Nock's essay, I hope that you'll maybe be convinced otherwise. Because I think for a lot of people, when they think about what's necessary for real change, right? How do we change the world? What sparks a real revolution or real fundamental change in the way we organize ourselves as a society? I think a lot of people, because they've been so indoctrined and so brainwashed by the pro-democracy propaganda, that they assume that we must wait until 50% plus one agree with us before we can really change course as a society. And that's not the case. Because understand, the average person is a follower. They're not a leader, right? They're not actually trying to drive things forward. In fact, they don't even care. And I'll share with you guys a quote from Albert J. Nock in a second, where he explores really what are the masses, who are the masses, and why they don't necessarily matter. But before we get into that, let's kind of couch this or frame this in a discussion about previous revolutions, right? Or previous big upheavals and change. One of my personal favorites for a subject matter, at least, is the American Revolution. And so, reminder, this is all based upon a Substack article that we published today. If you guys haven't checked us out on Substack, you can join for free, or you can even skip joining. You don't even have to give us your email. You just click the bottom thing where it's like, let me see first, and you'll be able to check out this article and every other article that we've read or wrote and shared here on Best Day Ever Media. I didn't write this like the perfect essay because, one, it's such a big, complex subject matter that honestly it was going to take me too long. I'll maybe go back eventually and write another essay, but I really wanted to have a nuanced and thoughtful conversation with you guys and with Adam in particular about this subject matter. But let's dive into the American Revolution first. So it's difficult to know with certainty what percentage of colonial America supported the revolution. One will often hear the anecdote that it was a war of the thirds. And what's meant by that is usually people will say about 1/3 of the colonial population supported the Patriots and Revolution. About 1/3 were Tories and loyal to Britain or loyalists, and 1/3 were indifferent or they were like fence sitters, right? They were trying to wait to see who won before they jumped in. Arthur R. Miller cites that at no time did more than 45% of colonists support the war, and at least a third of colonists sided with Britain. And the reason I bring this up is just, first of all, because understand the American Revolution, that didn't happen because 50% plus one of the population decided it needed to happen. It's really because a handful of individuals decided it needed to happen. And it happened a lot earlier than the moment the conflict started, right? So a lot of people think 1776, right? That's when it started. The Patriots of 76, all that stuff. No, it started far before that. It started with individuals like Samuel Adams, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson writing political pamphlets, right? Pushing forward narratives and perspectives that challenge the status quo. And a lot of people, when you're thinking about challenging the status quo, it's easy to think that you need to talk to the masses, right? I need to dumb down my stuff to the point that every single person will understand me in order to capture that 50% plus one of the population. But again, if the vast majority of the population are actually followers rather than leaders, maybe you should be focused on capturing the leaders and not capturing the average person, because you can trust the leaders to lead, where the average person is simply going to want to follow you. And honestly, straight up, they probably don't have the complex mental capacities to really explore these in nuanced manners. And so, jumping over to Isaiah's job, actually, you know what? I'm going to keep going here first. So, further in regards to the American Revolution, it wasn't 50% of the population that decided to sign the Declaration of Independence, right? It was a handful of leaders that decided to do that. And that handful of leaders came together because they had a handful of leaders. In fact, you can probably think about this kind of like the Pareto principle, right? It's not about capturing 80% of the population. Maybe it's about capturing 20% of the leaders. Or maybe it's about capturing 20% of the 20% of leaders in order to really drive change and be effective in that regards. When we look at the colonial army, or the Continental Army, I should say, it's estimated that the Continental Army size was approximately 100,000. So this is like everyone that was properly in the Revolutionary Army. If you were to include militiamen, it's maybe estimated that's another 250,000, maybe as high as 400,000 individual in regards to colonists. And this is at a time when the population was estimated to be around 2.7 million in the colonies. So we can estimate that maybe 4% of the population were in the Continental Army. And this is where often you'll hear cited like the 3%ers, right? And the idea is the 3%ers were the 3% of the population that actively fought in the Revolutionary War. Now, the reason it's often cited as 3% instead of the 4% I mentioned here is that 3% is actually based upon the number of individuals that filed for army pensions. And not everyone necessarily filed for an army pension. So they usually end up with about 80,000 people when they're doing their estimate. But if we include the militiamen, who often were just like on the home front, right? They were defending the home front. They were acting as police. They were just trying to keep peace and order in general, oftentimes not seeing active conflict per se. That's about 15% of the population. And again, the reason it's important to highlight this stuff is to understand that you don't necessarily need to wait until you got that 50% plus one to try and really enact change on society. Taking a step further back here, let's think about the well, I guess it'd be a few steps forward, but let's think about the Haitian Revolution. If you guys have never been exposed to it's a long book, don't get me wrong, but if you've never been exposed to the Black Jacobins, fascinating insights and look at the Haitian Revolution. And understand, there's something important to comprehend about the Haitian Revolution. It's literally the only large-scale slave revolt that's ever been successful in the history of humanity. The previous largest slave revolt was Spartacus. So you literally have to go back thousands of years before you're going to find another slave revolt. And spoiler alerts, if you haven't seen the movie or read the books, it doesn't actually end well for Spartacus and the slaves that revolted. Rome didn't crumble because of that. Whereas with Haiti, they actually did succeed in it. And again, it wasn't that every single slave rose up in arms. It can often be a handful of individuals that light the spark. Think back, and again, I know historians will argue about this, but with the Civil War, right? A lot of people think the Civil War essentially began with Abraham Lincoln being voted in and Kansas kind of being denied the ability to be a slave state and be a free state instead. However, throughout that period of time leading up to Abraham Lincoln's inauguration and election, you actually had bleeding Kansas, where you had people like I'm drawing a blank now. Is it Jim Brown? I think Jim Brown or John Brown. But essentially just decide to pick up arms and start trying to arm slaves in Kansas, start killing or attacking slave owners, and really trying to drive forward what they believed to be right. They weren't focused on the letter of the law. They were focused on what they believed to be the intention of the Constitution, and that every man was born equal and free. And so the reason, again, this is so important to understand the historical context here is when Jay Knock was actually writing this essay, he was writing it at a time when there was a lot of leading thought leaders that were trying to preach to the masses, right? They were trying to capture everybody's attention in order to push their political agenda forward. And in fact, I thought I highlighted this, but maybe it got deleted here. But essentially, oh, here we are. Perfect. So this is a direct quote from Isaiah's job. It occurred to me then that this story is much worth recalling, just now when so many wise men and soothsayers appear to be burdened with a message to the masses. Dr. Townsend has a message. Father Colin has one. Mr. St. Clair, Mr. Lipman, Mr. Chase, the Planned Economy Brethren, Mr. Tugwell and the New Dealers, Mr. Smith and the Liberty Leaguers. The list is endless. I cannot remember a time when so many energumens were so variously proclaiming the word to the multitude and telling them that they must do it to be saved. This being so, it occurred to me, as I say, that the story of Isaiah might have something in it to steady and compose the human spirit until this tyranny of wilderness is overpassed. I shall paraphrase the story in our common speech, since it has to be pieced out from various sources, and as much as respectable scholars have thought fit to put out a whole new version of the Bible in the American vernacular, I shall take shelter behind them, if need be, against the charge of dealing irreverently with the sacred scriptures. And so to summarize here, and I've got a few more quotes I want to share with you guys, but to summarize, essentially, this essay here, I believe it's like a fictional essay, but it's a great analogy to what's going on. And don't get me wrong, the historical context is true. But essentially what Jay was saying here, or Mr. Knock was saying here in his essay, was the concept that a friend of his had this great political doctrine. He had this great treatise on economics. And in fact, it could revolutionize the world and make everyone better for it. And he went on to explain it. And Knox said, he asked for feedback and advice. And he was like, hey, man, it's great that you have these thoughts. And it's great that you want to try and share them with the average person. But understand the average person's probably literally too stupid to fully comprehend this shit. But take heart, not in the fact that you must dumb down your language, not in the fact that you must dumb down your message, but instead focus on speaking to the remnant. And so this is where Isaiah's job comes in. And so for people that aren't familiar with exactly who Isaiah was, the prophet, let's get into it. Alberta J. Knock, in his essay, Isaiah's Job, uses the biblical story of the prophet Isaiah to explain what the revolutionaries and defenders of liberty and free speech must undertake. Do not preach to the masses. Do not turn to the elites, but preach to the remnant. So this is a direct quote from the essay. The official class and their intelligentsia will turn up their noses at you, and the masses will not even listen. They will all keep on in their own ways until they carry everything down to destruction, and you will probably be lucky if you get out with your life. Isaiah had been very willing to take on the job. In fact, he had asked for it. But the prospect put a new face on the situation. It raised the obvious question, why, if all that were so, if the enterprise were to be failure from the start, was there any sense in starting it? The Lord said, you do not get the point. There is a remnant. There that you know nothing about. They are obscure, unorganized, inarticulate, each one rubbing along as best he can. They need to be encouraged and braced up, because when everything has gone completely to the dogs, they are the ones who will come back and build up a new society. And meanwhile, your preaching will reassure them and keep them hanging on. Your job is to take care of the remnant. So be off now and set about it. And so this is in regards to essentially the Lord telling the prophet Isaiah, I think back in like 740 BC, that he needed to go forward and preach the good word to Jerusalem. And at the time, it was essentially falling on deaf ears, and Isaiah was being discouraged, right, in regards to that experience. And the Lord said, you don't need to talk to everyone, but I tell you, in Jerusalem, there's at least 7,000 of the remnant there. And those are the people you should seek out. Those are the people you should speak to. You can preach to everyone, but no, you're only talking to them. And this is important for those of us right now that maybe feel like we're surrounded or we're completely immersed in clown world, right? Where up is down and left is right, and the government says one thing and does the opposite, and no one seems to be living in alignment with the values or the virtues that they constantly signal to their fellow man. And the reason this is important, not just for freedom and liberty, not just for Bitcoiners, but for anyone that wants to try and enact real change in the world, know that just because you get 10 views on your live stream, just because you get one retweet, just because 5 people subscribe to your Substack, that you should still move forward. You should still preach the good word, but you need to know that you don't need to dumb down your message. You need to speak to the remnant. And essentially, the second essay I want to explore with you guys in a second is in regards to Bitcoiners are the remnant, the masses don't matter, by Alexander Svetsky. But first, on Isaiah's job, again, it's just so important to understand this concept here because and again, paraphrasing such nuanced language, this is a very dense essay with a lot of historical context and great examples used. It's difficult to paraphrase. I really encourage you guys. There's a link in the Substack article where you can grab all these articles. They're all free. If you don't like reading, there's even a free audiobook version of this that you can either download or live stream off of the Mises.org Institute. But as you explore this and you start to really internalize this fact that it's not about convincing the masses, it's about convincing the remnant, because the remnant are the ones that will go forward and build the New Jerusalem. They're the ones that will go forward and build a better world because they're action takers. But what they are right now is unorganized. They're ill-informed. They feel alone, right? And this is something that I've regularly talked about previously in other content I've created about trying to, via game theory, essentially, create common knowledge. It's not just enough that you know the truth, but for a lot of people, they need to know that other people know the truth because that gives them courage. That gives them hope. That gives them the ability to actually move forward on that. And you don't need 50% plus one to build the new future, to build your utopia. And obviously, utopias don't actually really exist. But it's important to understand that you should still move forward on this. And you need to be selective, essentially, in who you preach to. So the last part of the essay here, in regards to Isaiah's job, one might suggest, therefore, the aspiring prophetical talent may well turn to another field. Sat patri primogo datum. Whatever obligation of the kind may be due to the masses is already monstrously overpaid. So long as the masses are taking up the tabernacle of Moloch and Chun, their images, and following the star of their buncombe, they will have no lack of prophets to point the way that leadeth to more abundant life. And hence, a few of those who feel the prophetic afflatus might do better to apply themselves to serving the remnant. It is a good job, an interesting job, much more interesting than serving the masses, and moreover, is the only job in our whole civilization, as far as I know, that offers a virgin field. And this, to me, perfectly segues into the famous Breitbart quote, right? The idea that politics is downstream from culture. And culture is essentially dictated not by all of us, but by a handful of us, right? By influential individuals, by thought leaders. And that's what we need to be focused on if we want to enact real change. And in this just absolutely amazing article here from Bitcoin Magazine, again, that was written in regards to Bitcoiners are the remnant, the masses don't matter. Mass adoption of Bitcoin isn't important. Selective adoption is, and always has been, how any revolutionary technology or transformation comes about. The masses will join by default. And honestly, I just found this a fascinating exploration that Alexander does in this essay. He references Isaiah's job a multitude of times. But when people are like, well, does the average person use Bitcoin, right? Does your mom use Bitcoin? Does your grandpa use Bitcoin? That doesn't matter. That's not who you should really be preaching to. Who you want to preach to is the builders, the people that will take up the fight, the people that will take up arms and try and push forward on what they truly believe is important. So below are some selective quotes from Alexander's essay. I mean, for 12 years, Bitcoiners have been laughed at, not just by the mainstream, but by blockchainers, shitcoiners, no-coiners, the media, governments, the intelligentsia, and even so-called freedom fighters like Chris Guy. Which, side note here, I love the fact he takes shots at Chris Guy because he says some weird bombastic shit here. And anyone that's in the Canadian freedom movement, you're probably familiar. Again, doesn't mean that he's wrong on everything, but he's suspect on a few things. And now, against the backdrop of a world genuinely going to hell, we're fighting to build a Noah's Ark so that the remnant can get out with their lives and rebuild. The best you have, the best you are, and the best you can be. This is not only what the remnant will produce, but what the remnant will demand. For every one remnant who gets it, there are tens of thousands of those in the masses who don't. And whether it's more nature or more nurture, it doesn't matter because the precise blend is impossible to know. What counts is that one in every 10,000 or 100,000 will always rise above the rest. The masses are generally on the wrong side of history because of the madness inherent in crowds. They only find themselves right when it's the default position, after the truth forged forth by the remnant finally prevails. By the time they figure out what's happened, the trend is over. The upside is gone. This is why the masses don't never have and never will take a difference, nor really matter. Or sorry, make a difference or nor really matter. By the time they're all finally using Bitcoin in the same way they breathe oxygen, the remnant will be building cities and citadels, terraforming new lands, and unlocking intergalactic energy and investing cosmic teleportation. The remnant are the 20% that make possible the 80% in Pareto's distribution. And don't fret, despite my tone, this is a story of hope for all. The masses will always benefit in the end, and a select few will rise to the occasion and join the ranks of the remnant. They shall be unplugged. And obviously, that's a reference to the Matrix, right? Again, understand that Neo and Morpheus, they weren't the majority of individuals, right? You didn't need to get 50% plus one of the people in the Matrix to tear down the Matrix. You needed a handful of hardcore supporters that were going to push forward, right? People that truly believed in the ideology. And again, this is something that I really take and find hope in because it means that I don't need to get millions of people watching my live streams. It means that I need to speak to, at most or at minimum, an audience of one. I need to convince one of the remnant to understand that there is hope, that we can build a better future. And yeah, I like, again, there's so many different ways we could take this conversation. One last thing I want to point out is I tried to take my own take on this on my blog, and there's a link again in the Substack article to it in regards to Watch Out Western Man. And I kind of own this fact right off the bat that I was trying to speak to the remnant. I'm well aware that my title alone will have triggered some to automatically judge me and the contents of this essay. So be it. They are not the audience I seek to reach. But let's be clear on one fact. Western Man, at least in terms of this essay, is meant to represent Western classical liberalism and its ideals. Your philosophers explored social contracts, not social states. And yeah, again, I encourage you guys, go check out all three of these articles. Obviously, if you're only going to read one or two, read the other ones. You can skip mine. But I think it's important to understand we don't need to convince the masses. We don't need to preach to everyone. We need to preach to the remnant. If you want to really enact change, if you want to change the world, you can lead by example and convince a small group of individuals, right? Understand that this isn't just true in the American Revolution. The same concept of the remnant was explored way before J. Albert Nock ever thought of doing it. We've seen it from Plato, Marcus Aurelius, right? We see it in regards to Isaiah the prophet. And again, this is a pattern that seems to repeat itself in history, that it's a handful of individuals that change the world. It's not the masses. The masses are slow to adopt. And we should actually take heart in that. Because even if right now it feels like you're pushing up against an immovable object and you're in between a hard place, that doesn't mean that there's not hope, and that doesn't mean that you won't eventually be able to enact the change that you want to see in the world. So yeah, I guess rant over here, Adam. Kind of want to open things up to you and just get your thoughts or feedback on this. I know that Isaiah's job, Bitcoiners are the remnant, are probably new essays to you. Not sure if you checked out my Western Man essay back when I originally posted it, which was, I looked at it just kind of like, funnily enough, it was October 12th, 2021. And that was at a moment in time when I was really frustrated with the world because I felt like I saw something that a lot of people were either actively or ignorantly ignoring. And it was driving me crazy in regards to what I considered to be some of the financial consequences that we're starting to see play out now, as well as some of the social consequences, right, and social dynamics that are playing out in regards to things like the Freedom Trucker Convoy protests.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's a lot to unpack there in 25 minutes of reading through these guys' work and your own thoughts. One of the things that I don't feel satisfied yet on with these essays is like, how, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but like, how do you believe you can best find other remnants, right? Like, because like what we're doing here, right, is obviously a clear attempt for us to collect these types of thinkers, or at least shed light that these are our ideas, right? But like, I guess with Isaiah's job, the instructions there were actually to go out and preach this shit to as many people as possible, right? Like, he was told to, at reading through that essay, he was allegedly told, because I haven't read this actual passage, but he's told to, like, go talk to the paupers, and the riches and everybody else, and that, like, literally some very small portion of those people are going to be the remnants. But like, do you see a better or more effective way than, like, say, the strategy we're deploying today to try and just put this out on the internet? Like, how else would you go about finding these thought leaders? Because I feel like that is a challenge to the mediums that we use, where, like, if it truly is the leaders that we need to collect, I'm not certain that even this format is going to necessarily collect those people, right? Like, how do you get people of influence to pay attention to you when your message is so detrimental to their own personal interests? Like, if I take the average like Doug Ford, for example, on a story that we just talked about, right? He's going to abstain from testimony, even though, like, maybe it has to do with his own personal beliefs. But like, how do you get these leaders who have influence, real influence, and can collect followers to listen to you, and more importantly, to be bold enough to join you in the remnant cause? Like, do you have thoughts on that, Matt?
Yeah. I think that, like, as kind of the parable with Isaiah is laid out, it's enough to raise the flag. It's enough to preach, and that those individuals, while ignorant now, that will eventually belong to the remnant, they will see with time, right? And again, maybe it's not you that collects them. Maybe you inspire one individual that goes on to be a better preacher than yourself and is able to really draw more people into the fold. I think that leading by example is the absolute key to all of this. Living in alignment with your principles, not essentially compromising on things that you don't believe should be compromised upon, right? Think of how many people were just berated, barraged, completely overwhelmed by mass media hysteria around the COVID narrative. And yet a handful of individuals just knew that this wasn't right, that they weren't going to give in to medical tyranny. And think of, like, how slowly you might, like, for those individuals that maybe were like, no, I'm not going to get a vaccine just because the government told me to. I want to see more data. Or I want to see a justification for why me, as like a 37-year-old healthy male, needs to take this medical intervention when I don't really see or understand the need for it. And how, for a lot of us that maybe spoke out even briefly on social media, you'd get one DM of, yo, man, I can't say anything publicly, but, like, I agree with you. I think that's how you build courage. That's how you build a following. I'm drawing a blank on the book right now, but essentially there's a book that I know we did in our book club that talks about the leader is almost less important than the first follower, right? And that mass movements are often triggered by the second follower, and they go on to enact crazy change, right? Like, think about Jesus, right? And 12 disciples. He was willing to preach to everyone, but it was honestly those 12 disciples that really pushed things forward. And then it was Paul hanging out with those 12 disciples that led to Paul essentially building the Christian church as we know it today. And that all was just a handful of individuals. Sure, he preached to the masses. Maybe they listened, maybe they didn't. The fact that he was eventually killed for his beliefs probably tells you that the masses weren't in alignment with his message at that point in time. But eventually they did adopt to it. And I just want to share this one quote here that I didn't originally share from Isaiah's job. The line of differentiation between the masses and the remnant is set invariably by quality, not by circumstance. The remnant are those who by force of intellect are able to apprehend these principles, and by force of character are able, at least measurably, to cleave to them. The masses are those who are unable to do either. And so again, I think it's very rare the individual that's going to be willing to stand up. I think individuals can think of that meme, right? Of the taskmaster with the whip at the front and everyone's kneeling down. And then one dude at the front stands up, and then a handful of dudes stand up, and then eventually you've got everyone standing up. And it's because that person led by example and led from the front by choosing to stand up and take the risk.
In that particular visual or example, Matt, I can see a very clear incentive for the remnant, right? If you were the one who first stood in front of a whip and then were joined by just a few, and then perhaps that turns to many. I am challenged to reason through my own head why the average person would be incentivized to stand up to something like because it's so fresh and recent. I think the COVID narrative thing is just like how we have to think about this stuff because it's just front of mind. But the average guy who had to go to work to maintain his income, to hold on to his property, to hold on to his family's livelihood, to in order for literally the way I frame it is like sustenance. Like that man had very, very little incentive to stand up, right? It would have been so much more reward in the short term to fold than it would be to stand up. And I guess in your example of the whipping, it's very clear the incentive, right? But the incentive to you or I, who actually were, I would say, extremely principled throughout the COVID kind of years, right? We were very clear that we were never going to get vaccinated. We were very clear that the mask shit was bullshit once that was figured out. We were very clear that we had an obligation to share our story, but there was never really a clear incentive, I don't think, to publicly be saying these things. In fact, it probably lost us. And again, if we're going to paint them all as the masses, then those losses are to be expected and also not very it's almost moot, right? It's like a moot point that we lost those masses. But at the same time, for sure, it would have harmed our public credibility, image, all this other shit that you would have happen if you choose to be the remnant. And immediately, I don't see an obvious upside other than the fact that we get to live principled and feel like we did the right thing. Outside of that, and if that's your only thing, we were extraordinarily fortunate in that both of us had the finances and the willingness and ability and all that other stuff in order to be that person. But I don't see the clear benefit to the masses essentially to get them on board. Well, because if they had done that, they would have been fucking whipped.
I would argue that that's the whole point of the essay. You'll never convince them until they essentially convince themselves. And so again, it's like trying to talk your and again, there'll be edge case scenarios here, but I can remember trying to tell my parents about the internet and why it was useful. But it wasn't until all my dad's friends were using the internet and talking about the horse races, which he loved to keep track of, that he was like, okay, can you show me this internet thing? Because my buddy is constantly talking about how he can check the stats on the horse races faster than I can get it on the television. Yep. And so I think that in and of itself describes the situation here. And to your point that the average dude working a job that needs to get by won't be able to stand up or the incentives won't be there. Again, I don't disagree with that. But I can think of I know of an individual that I would count amongst the remnant. I won't dox him now, but he's a good friend of mine, known him since before kindergarten sort of thing, works in a trade, and they got an email from their company that said you have to be vaccinated. It is what it is. And him and a bunch of fellow employees had talked about it, and they'd all said no, not going to get it. A bunch of them caved. He didn't. And the reason he didn't is because, in my opinion, he's part of the remnant. And as that quote I previously shared said, through sheer intellect, right, and commitment to your principles, he wouldn't. But with that, naturally, even if you may not identify yourself as a leader, that you've got some leadership qualities to you, right? And that individual is going to know their worth. So he was just like, okay, well, consider this my resignation. And he'd worked his way into an important position at that company. It didn't come with a fancy title. There was nothing like that. But the shop couldn't function effectively without him. And so they were like, whoa. The owner of it sent an email back immediately to him and said let's not overreact to this. Let's take this conversation offline and see if we can't find something that works for everyone. And he was like, well, the only way it's going to work is if you literally don't enact this policy. And his wife, again, I would also place her amongst the remnant, because when it came to masking her children, She just wrote a letter to the school that was like, nope, under no circumstances will my child wear a mask. Under no circumstances will you force my child to constantly use antibacterial soap, right? Like they're not going to be constantly just rubbing their hands. I forget the brand, but you know the brand that's like, yeah, with Purell. She was just like, no, they won't do it. And if you've got an issue with that, come speak to me. And so their daughter was the only person going to this school that wasn't wearing a mask, that when they went in and out from recess didn't have to use Purell. And again, that maybe changed no one else's minds, but those people are part of the remnant, in my opinion, because they are willing to lead by example. The person that's living as a wage slave, paycheck to paycheck, they've already just adopted the mass movements, right? Like they're literally a sheep trying to stick in the herd so that they don't stand out. And so, like, if the herd goes off a cliff, they'll go off the cliff. If the herd goes to greener pastures, they'll go to those greener pastures. And it's going to be the couple sheep at the front that end up actually driving and leading where that herd ends up going. And so I think, again, that to me really just hits upon everything here. But I want to share with you another quote here from Isaiah's job. If a writer, you aim at getting many readers. If a publisher, many purchasers. If a philosopher, many disciples. If a reformer, many converts. If a musician, many auditors. Which is funny because you can tell how old this is because no one would reference a music listener as an auditor and so on. But as we see on all sides, in the realization of these several desires, the prophetic message is so heavily adulterated with trivialities in every instance that its effect on the masses is merely to harden them in their sins. Meanwhile, the remnant, all aware of this adulteration and of the desires that prompt it, turn their backs on the prophet and will have nothing to do with him or his message. And this, to me, I definitely run an anarchist and libertarian like thought circles, right? And so, again, in any sort of like political niche, you're going to hear the term grifter. And what is a grifter? A grifter, in my opinion, and I think majority of people's opinions, is someone that pretends to live in alignment with a certain set of principles, but their primary goal is to get the biggest audience. It's to make the most amount of money, right? It's to sell the most number of books. And the individual that's principled will take a completely different path than that grifter. And so again, like you can find grifters in the right, the left, the center, doesn't really matter. But they're individuals that will flip-flop on issues, right? Like 1 year they're for fracking, the next year they're against fracking, right? 10 years ago, they tell you they'll never ban handguns and take your guns away. 10 years later, they've got no issue with doing that. Those are individuals that, again, they're not part of the remnant. They never will be because they're grifters, right? They prefer to talk to the masses, not because that's where the best conversations are had. Not because that's where, the edges of society are pushed forward, but instead that's where the safety lies, right? Is in that herd mentality. So yeah, really appreciate that question, but hopefully that kind of helps navigate at least, I think, their thoughts as well as my thoughts on the subject matter.
Yeah, I mean, like in general, I think I fully agree with the position of these essays as well as your own. And I do find it interesting that the people that would be part of the remnant class, like they're often some of the most successful. And I think that's where the incentive actually lies, because they're able to chase their passion and carve out their little niche. Like as you were speaking there about grifters, I was thinking about, well, who's a great example of somebody that's the opposite of that. And I recently listened to a discussion with Rick Rubin, who's the producer of so many, like, just fucking killer music productions, like Red Hot Chili Peppers, Public Enemy, The Cult, Danzig, Kanye West, the Beastie Boys, Black Sabbath, Johnny Cash. And these are musicians and sounds and pieces of work that were so controversial and so like just out there, right? It was new, it was original, it was art for the sake of art, right? And I believe that somebody like that would fit into this category and obviously would reap the rewards of that type of behavior by sticking to like what they were truly principled in and passionate about and just making it. And if you listen to this interview, it's on Joe Rogan Experience number 1881. And this interview is very telling, right? It was never about the money. It was never about the fame. It was never about the number of audience members or how many people they could put in a stadium. That was a byproduct of staying principled and just making truly beautiful art. And I think that this is where To answer my previous question, like this is where being the remnant can be incentivized, right? Like you have the opportunity to follow your principles into a space where you're potentially rewarded for that later, right? And even if you face ostracization in the present.
Well, and one thing, like, I don't disagree with you on, but I want to add additional context. When you said that the remnant will often be the most successful, I agree, but on their terms. So they may not literally
Yes.
write the absolute best-selling book. They may not literally write the greatest song or the most bought or played song of all time, but they understand their principles. They understand their terms of engagement and how they define success, and they live in alignment with that, right? So, like, again, you don't even necessarily have to agree. And like, there's obviously going to be remnants in all sorts of different aspects of society, but like the remnant isn't the person that goes to a, communist, socialist sort of like uh, protest and then is wearing Nikes and drives home in their mass produced car and lives in their McMansion, stuff like that. It's the person that decides that they're going to start a co op and they're literally going to try and live off the earth and invite other individuals and try and create their own version of society, right? It's the individual that, like Kanye West, that might zig and zag and it might even look confusing to the outside observer, but they're truly living in alignment with themselves. And that's where like true innovation occurs as well, is on the edges of society. It's rarely going to come from the center, because the center, again, is where the safety is. And one more quote I want to share with you guys, and then we can wrap up if we don't have anything else to say on the subject matter. But Isaiah, and again, this is from Albert J. Nock. Isaiah, on the other hand, worked under no such disabilities. He preached to the masses only in the sense that he preached publicly. Anyone who liked might listen. Anyone who liked might pass by. He knew that the remnant would listen, and knowing also that nothing was to be expected of the masses under any circumstances, he made no specific appeal to them, did not accommodate his message to their measure in any way, and did not care two straws whether they heeded it or not. As a modern publisher might put it, he was not worrying about circulation or about advertising. Hence, with all such obsessions quite out of the way, he was in the position to do his level best, without fear of favor, and answer only to his august boss. The remnant, on the other hand, want only the best you have, whatever they may be. Give them that, and they are satisfied. You have nothing more to worry about. The profit of the American masses must aim consciously at the lowest common denominator of intellectual taste and character among 120 million, today would be 350 million people. And this is a distressing task. I think, again, that's something where I find so much hope in this language and this train of thought, because again, and I know like you're a big fan of Luke Fiasco, right? And he talks about like, you got to dumb it down,
Dumb
Luke,
it
in one of
down.
his songs. And it's like, well, no, maybe you don't, right? Like, again, it depends on how you define success. But if success to you is creating the best art you're capable of, you never have to dumb down that art. And you will find ways to reframe success for yourself, right? And again, like literally, in my opinion here, anyone can stumble upon these YouTube videos. Anyone can choose to try and make their life better, to try and have the best day ever. But really, this show is as much about you and me preaching to each other to try and drive each other to become better versions of ourselves, to become greater thinkers, more intellectual, all the different aspects of life, versus trying to convince every single person that they need to buy a sauna or that they need to do this, that, or the other. It's like, no, it's about us confirming amongst ourselves, right? And again, it's important to understand the social dynamics of the average person, right? You're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. I'd much rather find myself amongst the remnant than versus the masses. And I think that that's honestly true even of a larger portion of the population than likely makes up the remnant. I think that there are individuals in the masses that can become the remnant, but first they have to be captured by ideas. I think that the most captivating ideas aren't watered down. They're not distilled. They're pure, right? And it's like, it's the sort of thing of like, Michael Malice gets called out on being an anarchist, right? And people are like, well, why don't you live in the woods? Like, why aren't you literally trying to overthrow the government right now? And he very intellectually and honestly will explore that and say, listen, anarchy, right? Freedom is my top priority. It's not my only priority, right? There's other values that I have. And so there's trade-offs to be made there. But I actively choose to engage in those trade-offs rather than simply bow down to the masses. And that maybe sounds nuanced, or maybe even sounds like, to the casual observer, like I'm talking out both sides of my mouth. But I think if you spend some real time and think about it, you'll come to the realization that, oh no, he's defining success how he sees fit, and he's playing the game within it, right?
Yeah, and also attracting, people of like Spade to himself. Like, he's definitely, by preaching that message, those people that agree with his values and feel like they identify with those values as well have been absolutely attracted to him, and he's found success in that way. So yeah, I mean, I can't fault that. And I certainly, that last quote was, particularly relevant, I would think, to this show, right? Where it's like, we're doing this whether there's going to be 10 views or 100 million views, and either way, it doesn't really matter. And we've had talks in the past, right, where we discuss, for under no circumstance will we become somebody else in order to farm engagement, right? It's like, we will do this show with our highest quality that we can put out, and with the highest level of truth that we can put out. And that's how we're going to produce this show, whether anybody ever watches this. And in fact, if you're watching this right now, just know that there are 0 live concurrent viewers at the moment on YouTube or Facebook or anything.
At least Rumble says we have 2.
Well, excellent. Our 2 bots are still here. So, but seriously, like, I really respect this train of thought, and like the intellectual exploration that we get to do on this show with each other, because I know that there is going to be one other person that watches this, right? And we found that out already. And so I'm excited by that fact, and I'm excited by the fact that, we aren't alone. And it's also, for me, like, one of the most rewarding things over the last 2 years has been to find out that there are other people like yourself, Matt, that are principled enough to stand up for their shit. Like, that to me is perhaps the biggest white pill we can have, in that, like, if only it was the 2 of us in the entire world that were principled enough to stand up for our shit, we at least did it. And that to me is like, that is like it gives me chills right now, because it's like, it honestly, I believe it only does take one person to start that, right? And the second person is absolutely mental for following the one person, but everyone after that, it becomes more and more appropriate to follow. So I'm really excited that we're here, and that we can say we stuck to our principles, man.
And then one last point on this is, like, look towards 1984 or The Handmaid's Tale, and maybe to a lesser extent Brave New World. But understand that, again, even though Winston Smith, right, didn't go on to be successful in causing the revolution, it was literally just the knowledge that there was at least one other dissident out there like him that gave him the hope, right, that allowed him to fight for as long as he did against the machinery. And that form of subversion, that form of, like, political protest, may be very small actions, right? But they're actions that he actively chose to take regardless of the consequences. In The Handmaid's Tale, spoiler alert, though it's a pretty old book, so I don't think there's a lot to be said here. Well, again, like with Winston Smith, I kind of arguably spoiled that book as well. But with The Handmaid's Tale, again, with the posterity of the last chapter where they explore the historical concept, it wasn't that I don't even remember the organization now, but essentially the resistance in that society, they weren't large. It wasn't that every household had a dissident in it. It was there was a handful of individuals, and they each gave each other strength, and they were able to create that underground railroad to Canada or the UK. And it was just knowing that there was at least one other, like, kindred spirit out there that gave them strength, that gave them hope. And while we don't know exactly how that society collapsed, it's never purely laid out in the book. It's still important to understand the context there, right? That, like, sticking to your principles, I think it's as important as it's ever been. And it will always be important to the remnant. And you only really want to be speaking to, like, good faith actors, in my opinion, right? Like, people that actually care about these things versus trying to trick someone. I don't think you can trick someone into your political ideology, right? I don't think, again, even I would argue socialists, communists, those on the left often try and trick or incentivize with, carrots and sticks in order for people to oblige themselves to that preferred policy. But it only lasts for so long. right? You eventually see the Berlin Wall crumble. And sometimes it takes far longer than we'd like to see the next era, to see real change enacted. But it is still there on the horizon as long as there's at least one dissident out there.
Yeah, I mean, exciting and thoughtful, provoking discussion here today, Matt. So, yeah, I mean, thank you very much for introducing me to these essays, and I'll absolutely take the time to go back and read them fully when I've got a moment and full focus on them. But I thought that this discussion was one of our best to date. So, very excited by that prospect and to see where we can take this from here.
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate you guys watching. Smash the like, leave us comments, share on social, all that good stuff. Definitely consider joining our Substack, become part of our little remnant here. Join the Telegram chat, share your thoughts, your opinions, your stories you think we should be covering as well, because we really do appreciate that. And I'd like to think that this is important. Again, whether it's for an audience of 1 or an audience of 1 million. And those of us that can't help ourselves have a duty to try and move forward on this political discourse. So appreciate you guys. That's all I've got to say.
Awesome. Well, that was our Cheaper Than Therapy Wednesday show on history and politics. Tomorrow is going to be a little more lighthearted because that's our random hobbies and interests show. And for the Thursday show, we're actually going to be discussing how to improve the accuracy of your rifle. And I'm going to be discussing why that's an important thing if you're interested in becoming a hunter, if you're already a hunter, or if you just simply want to play around with rifles for sport. I'm going to be exploring a couple reasons why that is important. It's not all just about bragging rights to your buddies that you can shoot a better grouping or that you can hit that bullseye from a certain distance. But I'm going to explore with you why I believe it's important to be ethical, right? And as a hunter, you really want to be ethical if you're going to take another animal's life. They may not be conscious, they may be, I'm not really sure, but if you're going to make that decision, you better make it count, and you do not want to have any mistakes made from that perspective. So I'm going to teach you all about how to improve the accuracy of your rifles. And, of course, that has nothing to do with the remnant discussion, but I believe that part of having the best day ever is being a well-rounded individual in both your intellect and your ability to execute. And I think that this is a part of that. And so I'd like to share that hobby and my personal interest with you. And, maybe it will inspire you to pick up a rifle and shoot for sport, or maybe even provide sustenance for your family, friends, and community. So looking forward to that discussion, and we'll see you guys tomorrow. Have a great day, and I hope you have the best day ever.
They say life is what you make it. So what happens if you actually try? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? Actually try to live your best day ever. What if you actually grind out when the time's right? What if you actually blinded by your hindsight? What if you actually find out what defines life? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? I'm getting 1% better every day. I'm getting 1% better every way. I'm waking up every day to a sunny day. No matter what the weather say, life is like a record, so just let it play.